Hello. Take a moment to settle in, wherever you are. There is no need to hold on to anything closely right now. Nothing here requires effort or memory or agreement. It only asks for attention, the kind that softens rather than sharpens. Imagine standing in a place where the ground beneath your feet is not neutral, not empty, not silent. The earth does not wait for meaning to be placed upon it. It already carries meaning, held quietly, without explanation. Hills are not shapes, rivers are not roots, stones are not objects. Each exists with its own weight of presence, shaped by time, weather, and countless moments of being noticed and forgotten again. In the Celtic world, this is where understanding begins, not with stories, and not with figures who stand above the world, but with the land itself as something that remembers. Memory here does not belong to minds alone. It belongs to soil compacted by footsteps, to water that has followed the same curve for centuries, to trees that grow knowing where they stand. The land is not scenery. It is a participant. It responds, endures, and sometimes withdraws. Sacredness, in this way of seeing, is not created by walls or rituals. There is no moment when a place becomes holy because it has been named so. A place is sacred because it has never been otherwise. The boundary between ordinary ground and meaningful ground does not exist. A field can hold as much weight as a hilltop. A quiet crossing of paths can matter as much as any gathering. Nothing needs to be elevated above the world in order to matter within it. This does not mean that every place is constantly charged with importance. It means something subtler. Importance is not fixed. It shifts. It emerges through relationship. A place becomes known because something happens there, or because nothing ever happens there at all. Absence can be as meaningful as presence. Silence can hold as much as sound. To live within such a world is to understand that the land is not passive. It gives and withholds. It shapes the rhythm of life without commanding it. People do not dominate the land, nor are they dominated by it. They exist alongside it, adjusting, listening, responding. When the ground is fertile, life flourishes. When it is harsh, life adapts. There is no sense that the land is testing anyone or offering rewards. It simply is what it is, and in being so, it teaches how to remain. Because the land is alive in this way, it does not separate the visible from the invisible. What can be seen is not the whole of what exists. A hill is a hill, but it is also more than its shape. A body of water reflects the sky, but it also holds depth that cannot be measured by sight alone. The world is layered, not divided. The unseen does not exist elsewhere. It exists here, overlapping, waiting to be noticed. This is where the idea of another mode of existence begins to feel natural. Not as a distant realm, and not as a place reserved for the dead, but as a different state of presence that moves alongside the familiar one. It does not replace the visible world. It does not oppose it. It simply occupies the same space at a different angle of attention. You do not arrive there by leaving this world behind. You do not cross into it through judgment or transformation. You encounter it by accident, or by timing, or by being slightly out of step with the ordinary rhythm of things. A moment lingers longer than expected. A place feels deeper than it looks. The air seems to hold its breath. Nothing dramatic needs to occur. Often, nothing does. In such moments, the boundary thins, not because a door has opened, but because there was never a wall to begin with. The land allows for this. It does not guard its layers. It reveals them when conditions are right, and conceals them when they are not. This is not an act of generosity or secrecy. It is simply how a living system behaves. To understand this, it helps to release the idea that reality must be singular. There is no single version of the world that overrides all others. There are overlapping states of being, each complete in itself, each capable of touching the others. None is ultimate. None is false. They coexist without needing to be reconciled. Time in such a world does not press forward in a straight line. It does not rush toward conclusions. It curves. It folds back on itself. What has been does not disappear. It settles into the land, into memory, into pattern. What will be is not distant. It is already forming, shaped by what has always been. This is why stories do not feel trapped in the past. They are not records of something that is gone. They are expressions of something that continues. When a story is told, it does not reappear. It remains. It has always remained. The telling is simply another way it moves through the world. Because time behaves this way, there is no urgency toward endings. There is no sense that history is marching toward a final moment when everything will be resolved. Change happens. Certainly, forms shift, presences withdraw and return, but nothing is erased. Nothing is concluded beyond recall. Within this system, what might be called gods do not stand apart from the world. They are not architects who designed it from a distance. They are not rulers who impose order upon it. They arise from the same fabric as the land, the same shifting layers of presence and absence. They are expressions of forces that already exist, made visible through story and perception. The collective, known as the Tuatha De Danann, can be understood in this way. Not as a hierarchy of named individuals, and not as a family of personalities, but as a way of speaking about the divine as it appears within the world rather than above it. They are not separate from the land, they belong to it. When they act, they do so within the limits of the system that produced them. Their withdrawal from the visible world is not a fall, and not a loss. It is a change of emphasis. As attention shifts, so does presence. What was once encountered openly becomes encountered indirectly. This is not defeat, it is adjustment. The world continues. The layers rearrange themselves. Death, within such a framework, cannot be an ending. It cannot be a judgment. It is a movement from one mode of presence to another. What was visible becomes less so. What was tangible becomes subtle. Nothing is expelled from the system. Nothing is finalized. All of this begins with the land, because the land holds everything. It holds time without marking it. It holds memory without narrating it. It holds the living and the unseen without distinguishing between them. To understand the Celtic world is not to learn its stories, but to feel this orientation settle into place, quietly, like weight redistributing itself. There is no need to hold on to these ideas tightly. They are not meant to be retained as concepts. They are meant to be recognized, the way one recognizes a landscape after spending time within it, familiar, without needing to be named. As this sense of the land settles, it becomes easier to notice how movement occurs within it. Not travel from one place to another, but movement of presence, a shift that does not require distance, a change that happens without departure. The world breathes in this way, expanding and contracting, revealing and concealing, without ever breaking itself apart. What appears solid is not fixed. What appears absent is not gone. The visible world and the unseen do not take turns replacing one another. They coexist, and which one feels closer depends on attention, timing, and circumstance. A familiar path may suddenly feel unfamiliar. A place passed every day may one day feel full in a way that cannot be explained. Nothing new has arrived. Nothing old has returned. The relationship has simply changed. This is why the idea of another mode of existence does not feel remote or elevated. It does not sit above the world, nor beneath it. It lies beside it, sharing the same ground. One does not ascend or descend to reach it. One drifts into alignment with it, often without intention. The boundary between these states is not moral. It does not respond to worthiness or belief. It responds to rhythm, to being slightly out of time with the ordinary pace of things, to moments when attention loosens its grip on usefulness and allows itself to rest in perception instead. Because of this, encounters with what lies alongside the visible world are rarely dramatic. There is no sense of crossing a threshold with ceremony. More often, there is a quiet realization that something has been present all along. A feeling of depth where none was noticed before, a moment that stretches, not because it is important, but because it is complete. In such moments, the world does not transform, it clarifies. What was always layered becomes briefly transparent. Then, just as naturally, it settles back into opacity. No lesson is delivered, no instruction is given. The experience does not demand interpretation. It simply adds weight to the understanding that reality is not exhausted by what can be named. This layered world reshapes how time is felt. Time here is not a force pushing everything forward. It is not an arrow aimed at an ending. It is a pattern of return and variation. Days follow days. Seasons follow seasons. Events echo one another without repeating exactly. What has passed is not sealed away. It remains accessible, not as memory alone, but as presence woven into the land. A hill does not belong to one moment. It has been stood upon in countless ways. It has been known and unknown, used and ignored. Each of these states still exists within it. To walk there now is not to arrive after everything else. It is to join a continuum that has never stopped unfolding. Because time behaves like this, there is no sharp distinction between myth and life. Stories are not accounts of a distant age that has vanished. They are expressions of patterns that continue to assert themselves. When a story is told, it is not recalled. It is activated, not brought back, but brought forward into awareness. This is why stories do not need to be organised chronologically. Order does not give them meaning. Relationship does. A story is understood by how it resonates with the land, with experience, with other stories. It does not point toward a conclusion. It circles, deepens, and settles. Within this circular sense of time, beings that carry divine presence do not stand outside history. They do not predate the world in a way that separates them from it. They arise within the same cycles, shaped by the same rhythms. Their power is not absolute. It is contextual. It depends on alignment rather than command. The Tuatha De Danann, understood as a collective expression of divine forces, belong to this pattern. They are not creators who finished their work and withdrew. They are presences whose mode of being shifted as the balance of attention within the world shifted. Their withdrawal is not an absence. It is a change in how they are encountered. They do not rule from hidden thrones. They do not watch from beyond. They remain within the fabric of the world, less visible, more diffuse, encountered indirectly through place, through story, through moments when the layers draw close again. They have not been replaced. They have not been surpassed. The world has simply adjusted how it meets them. This adjustment does not signal progress. There is no sense that one age improves upon another. There is only variation. Emphasis moves. What was once foreground becomes background. What was once encountered openly becomes encountered through traces and echoes. Nothing is lost in the sense of being destroyed. It is redistributed. Because of this, there is no expectation of a final rupture, no moment when the layers will collapse into one or separate completely, no ending toward which everything moves. The world does not require resolution. It sustains itself through continuity, not culmination. Death, within this understanding, cannot function as a boundary that severs. It is another form of redistribution, a change in how presence is held. The living do not depart the world when they die. They alter their relationship to it. Visibility shifts, tangibility fades, but connection remains. This is why death does not carry moral weight. It is not a reward or a consequence. It does not evaluate a life. It does not send anyone elsewhere. It is a movement within the same system that governs all other changes. Just as day moves into night without judgment, presence moves into a subtler form without verdict. The dead are not removed. They are not stored. They are not elevated or diminished. They are absorbed back into the layered world, held by land, by memory, by pattern. This absorption does not erase individuality, but it does loosen its boundaries. What was once contained within a body becomes dispersed across relationships. This dispersal is not frightening. It is familiar. It mirrors the way everything else functions. Rivers disperse into soil. Seasons disperse into one another. Stories disperse into variations. Nothing insists on remaining fixed. To be oriented within this world is not to master it. It is to relax into its logic. To stop expecting clarity to come from separation, hierarchy, or final answers. Meaning arises from participation, not from explanation. As this understanding deepens, it becomes possible to encounter any Celtic myth without confusion, not because its details are memorized, but because its assumptions feel familiar. The land acts because land is alive. The unseen appears because it was never absent. Time bends because it never moved straight. Divine forces act within limits because they are part of the system, not outside it. Death transforms because nothing ever truly leaves. This is not a system that asks to be believed. It asks only to be noticed. Once noticed, it does not need to be defended or justified. It continues quietly, whether attention rests upon it or not. The world remains layered. The land remains present. The cycles continue their slow turning. Understanding does not arrive as a conclusion. It settles gradually, like a body finding balance without conscious effort. As this orientation continues to settle, the sense of separation between things grows weaker. Not because distinctions disappear, but because they lose their rigidity. The world is no longer divided into compartments that must be understood one at a time. Instead, everything appears in relation, defined less by what it is alone, and more by how it touches what surrounds it. In such a world, identity is not fixed. A place is known by how it behaves over time. A presence is known by how it responds. Even a moment is known by how it opens or closes awareness. Nothing insists on being only one thing. Everything carries the possibility of shifting without breaking. This is why encounters in Celtic myth rarely feel staged or deliberate. They arise from coincidence, from misalignment, from lingering too long or arriving too early. A person steps slightly out of rhythm with the ordinary flow of time and suddenly finds themselves noticing what usually goes unnoticed. The world has not changed. Attention has. This attention is not sharp or analytical. It is receptive. It allows impressions to form without immediately naming them. It notices tone rather than meaning, depth rather than explanation. In this state, the layered nature of the world becomes easier to feel. The visible does not vanish. It simply becomes less complete. Because of this, the otherworld does not demand belief. It does not require acceptance as a doctrine. It is experienced as a difference in texture, not as a contradiction of reality. It feels closer to waking from a dream than to entering a new place. Familiar, yet altered. Continuous, yet distinct. There is no hierarchy between these states. One is not more real than the other. One is not superior, purer, or truer. They are parallel expressions of the same world, each accessible under different conditions. This removes the need for conflict between them. They do not compete for dominance. They coexist. This coexistence shapes how power is understood. Power does not reside in authority or command. It resides in alignment. A presence is powerful when it moves in harmony with the rhythms of the world. When it resists those rhythms, its influence weakens. Control is not admired. Responsiveness is. Divine forces within this understanding are not exempt from limitation. They do not override the structure of reality. They participate in it. Their actions matter because they are situated, not because they are absolute. They are subject to timing, to place, to consequence. Their influence waxes and wanes just as seasons do. This is why they do not dominate human life. They intersect with it, sometimes closely, sometimes distantly. Their presence is felt through changes in atmosphere rather than through commands or revelations. They do not instruct humanity. They reflect aspects of the world that humanity already inhabits. The Tuatha De Danann, when understood as a collective expression of such forces, embody this principle. They are not defined by genealogy or hierarchy. They are known by how they relate to the land, to skill, to memory, to transformation. Their significance lies not in who they are, but in how they function within the system. When their presence recedes from the visible world, nothing collapses. There is no sense of abandonment. Life continues as it always has, shaped by the same rhythms, grounded in the same land. What changes is not the structure of the world, but the angle from which it is experienced. This withdrawal does not signal a loss of sacredness. Sacredness was never concentrated in visible beings alone. It was always distributed throughout the world. When attention shifts away from certain forms, it naturally settles more deeply into others. The sacred does not vanish. It redistributes itself. This redistribution is gentle. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It becomes noticeable only in hindsight, as patterns emerge over time. A place feels quieter than it once did. A story is told less often. A presence is felt indirectly rather than directly. None of this implies absence. It implies transformation. Transformation, here, does not mean improvement or decline. It means continuity through change. What was expressed one way finds another form. What was encountered openly becomes encountered through memory, through trace, through echo. The world adapts without discarding itself. This adaptive quality is central to understanding death within this system. Death is not an interruption. It is a transition that mirrors countless others. Just as night follows day without negating it, death follows life without erasing it. Presence shifts. Relationship changes. The world absorbs what has moved on without closing around it. There is no sorting, no accounting, no final placement. The dead are not judged or reassigned. They are not elevated to another realm nor confined to one. They remain within the same layered reality, encountered differently, held differently. Memory becomes one of the primary ways they continue to exist, but not the only way. The land itself participates in this holding. Places retain impressions. Paths remember passage. Ground holds the weight of those who walked upon it. This is not metaphorical. It is experiential. A place feels altered by what has occurred there, even when the details are forgotten. The land does not explain. It retains. Because of this, the past is never entirely past. It does not intrude. It does not demand attention. It simply remains available, folded into the present. When a story surfaces, it is not because it has been preserved intentionally. It is because the conditions allowed it to re-emerge. This re-emergence does not restore the past as it was. It presents it as it can be understood now. Stories shift as they move through time, not because they degrade, but because they remain alive. A story that could not change would not belong to this world. It would be fixed, and fixation is foreign here. Understanding this allows the listener to release the need for consistency in myth. Contradictions are not errors. Variations are not problems. They are signs of a living tradition adjusting itself across time and place. Meaning is not located in uniformity. It is located in resonance. Resonance does not require agreement. It requires recognition. A story resonates when it feels aligned with the way the world is experienced, when it fits into the patterns already felt, even if it cannot be explained. This is why myths can be understood without analysis. They speak to perception before they speak to reason. As this orientation deepens, the listener does not accumulate knowledge, they lose the need for it. The world begins to make sense without being broken down. The land feels active without being personified. The unseen feels present without being defined. Time feels fluid without becoming confusing. This is not a worldview that demands constant awareness. It functions even when ignored. People can live within it without naming it. Understanding it does not grant special access or insight. It simply removes friction. Stories become easier to follow. Places become easier to feel. Change becomes less threatening. There is no end point to this understanding. It does not culminate in revelation. It settles gradually like familiarity. The world does not reveal its secrets. It reveals its nature quietly by continuing to be what it is. As familiarity with this way of seeing grows, the need to separate experience into categories continues to soften. Meaning no longer waits at the end of explanation. It appears within relationship itself. How something meets the world matters more than what it is called. How long it remains matters more than when it began. Within this orientation, human life is not placed at the centre, nor is it pushed to the margins. It exists as one presence among many, shaped by the same forces that shape stone, water, and weather. Humanity does not stand above the land as a steward, nor beneath it as a subject. It stands within it, participating without privilege. This participation is quiet. It does not require constant awareness or reverence. People can live ordinary lives, attend to work, family, and survival, without ever naming the system that holds them. The world does not withdraw because it is not acknowledged. It continues, indifferent to recognition, steady in its patterns. What matters is not belief, but alignment. When actions move against the grain of the world, friction arises. When they move with it, life feels supported, even when it is difficult. This support is not reward. It is resonance, a sense that effort is met rather than resisted. Because the world operates through resonance, not command. There is no centralized authority governing meaning. There is no single voice that explains reality. Knowledge is not delivered from above. It emerges locally, shaped by place, by moment, by relationship. What is true in one valley may feel distant in another, without either being false. This decentralization extends to everything that might otherwise be organized into systems. There is no universal doctrine, no standardized practice, no fixed interpretation. Sacredness exists without institutions. Connection exists without instruction. Understanding passes through experience rather than through teaching. Within such a framework, figures that carry divine presence are not intermediaries between humanity and something higher. They are expressions of the same world, encountered differently. They do not bridge a gap because no such gap exists. They do not reveal hidden truths. They make visible what is already there. When these presences interact with people, the interaction does not establish hierarchy. It establishes contact. Neither side holds absolute authority. Outcomes are shaped by timing, by responsiveness, by the surrounding conditions. Power shifts moment by moment, never settling permanently. This is why divine forces can be outmaneuvered, surprised, or constrained, not because they are weak, but because they are embedded. They do not stand outside causality. They move within it. Their influence is real, but it is not total. They shape and are shaped in return. The Tuatha De Danann, understood in this light, represent this embedded divinity. They do not preside over the world, they participate in it. Their skills, associations, and actions reflect forces that remain active, regardless of how visibly they are encountered. When they recede from direct interaction, those forces do not disappear. They continue, diffused across the landscape of experience. This diffusion is essential. It prevents concentration of meaning. Nothing holds all significance. Nothing claims final authority. Sacredness cannot be monopolized. It must remain distributed in order to function. When attention narrows too tightly, meaning slips away. When attention relaxes, it returns. This relaxed attention also shapes how continuity is understood across generations. There is no sharp divide between ancestors and descendants. Influence flows both ways. The past shapes the present not as instruction, but as pattern. The present reshapes the past not by altering it, but by reinterpreting it through lived experience. Stories in this sense are not preserved intact. They are carried forward through use. Each telling adjusts emphasis, tone, detail. What remains constant is not content, but orientation. The story continues to express how the world works, even as its surface changes. This ongoing adjustment does not dilute meaning, it sustains it. A story that cannot change becomes disconnected from the world it describes. In a living system, adaptation is not loss, it is survival. This is why contradictions can coexist without resolution. One account does not cancel another. They occupy different angles within the same field of understanding. Each reveals something the other does not. Together, they create depth rather than confusion. Depth, here, is not complexity. It is density of presence, a sense that more is held than can be immediately accessed. The world does not reveal everything at once because it does not need to. Understanding accumulates gradually, through repeated contact rather than sudden insight. Death fits naturally into this density. It does not puncture the world, it thickens it. What was once visible adds itself to the unseen layers. The living continue, not burdened by the dead, but accompanied by them. The relationship changes, but it does not end. There is no moment when the dead must be released in order for life to go on. Nor is there a moment when life must be halted in order to honour the dead. Both states exist together, overlapping, neither cancelling the other. Because death does not conclude anything, there is no anticipation of a final reckoning, no gathering of outcomes, no summation of existence. The world does not move toward closure. It sustains itself through continuation. This continuation is not endless repetition, it is variation with instability. Patterns recur, but never exactly the same way. Each cycle carries traces of the last, adjusted by circumstance. Nothing resets completely. Nothing is trapped. Within this framework, fear of ending loses its intensity. Change is expected. Loss is real, but not annihilating. Absence is felt, but it does not hollow the world. What has been continues to exert influence, quietly, without demanding attention. This understanding does not eliminate grief. It alters its shape. Grief becomes a form of adjustment rather than a confrontation with nothingness. It is the process of learning how a relationship has changed, not the shock of discovering it has vanished. All of this unfolds without instruction. The world does not explain itself. It invites orientation through presence. To live within it is not to master its logic, but to become familiar with its movement. As familiarity grows, myths begin to feel less like stories and more like reflections, not mirrors held up to the past, but surfaces that reveal how perception itself functions. They do not ask to be decoded, they ask to be inhabited, briefly, quietly, without insistence. Understanding, then, does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as ease, a sense that the world no longer requires constant interpretation. That meaning can be felt without being named. That existence does not need to justify itself. As ease replaces the need for explanation, attention begins to settle on how balance is maintained without control. The world does not require supervision to remain coherent. It does not rely on enforcement, correction, or constant intervention. Order arises from relationship rather than from rule. This becomes especially clear in how change unfolds. change is not treated as a disruption that must be repaired. It is expected. It is accommodated. The world does not resist transformation. It absorbs it, redistributing weight and emphasis until equilibrium returns in a new form. Because of this, power is never centralized for long. Anything that gathers too much influence begins to strain against the system that holds it. Excess draws resistance not as punishment, but as correction. Balance reasserts itself quietly, without spectacle. This applies equally to human actions and to divine presence. Neither operates beyond consequence. Neither is insulated from response. When alignment falters, tension arises. When alignment returns, tension dissolves. No authority announces this. It is felt through circumstance. This way of functioning leaves little room for domination. Control, when attempted, proves temporary. It cannot sustain itself because it does not resonate with the broader movement of the world. What endures is adaptability, the ability to respond rather than impose. Within myth, this often appears as a subtle reversal. A figure with strength or skill finds that these alone are insufficient. Timing matters, place matters, awareness matters. The world responds not to force, but to fit. This does not frame existence as fragile, it frames it as responsive. Nothing needs to be defended aggressively because nothing is under constant threat. The system is resilient precisely because it allows movement. Rigidity is what breaks. This responsiveness also explains why no single story claims ultimate authority. A story does not override experience, it accompanies it. When experience shifts, stories shift as well, not to remain relevant, but because relevance is not optional in a living tradition. The same is true of divine presence. When the Tuatha De Danann recede from open interaction, it is not because they have been defeated or displaced. It is because the mode of relationship has changed. The world has adjusted how it expresses the forces they embody. This adjustment does not require replacement. Nothing new arrives to take their place. The system does not function through succession. It functions through redistribution. What was once encountered as personified presence becomes encountered as influence, tendency, or pattern. These patterns continue to shape life without drawing attention to themselves. Skill persists, inspiration persists, memory persists. The forces associated with them have not vanished. They have become less localized, more diffuse. This diffusion mirrors how sacredness itself operates. Sacredness is not contained within specific forms. It flows. It pools temporarily, then moves on. It is felt most strongly where relationship is most active, not where designation is most rigid. This means that sacredness can be encountered in ordinary moments without preparation. A task performed with attention, a place entered without expectation, a pause that allows perception to deepen. None of these require ritual framing. They arise naturally. Because sacredness is not confined, there is no anxiety about losing access to it. It cannot be withheld. It cannot be revoked. It does not depend on correct behavior or belief. It exists as a quality of engagement rather than as a reward. This absence of conditional access removes the need for moral accounting at the level of existence itself. Life is not evaluated from above. Actions carry consequences, but those consequences are relational, not judicial. They arise from interaction, not from verdict. Death, within this context, does not resolve anything. It does not finalize meaning. It does not close accounts. It simply alters the terms of relationship. What was once direct becomes indirect. What was once immediate becomes layered. The dead continue to matter, not because they are remembered, but because they remain part of the system. Memory is one way they persist, but not the only way. Their influence is carried through land, through habit, through pattern. This persistence does not trap the living in obligation. It does not demand constant acknowledgement. It exists quietly, available without pressure. The world does not insist that the past be honoured in specific ways. It allows space for forgetting as well as remembering. Forgetting is not erasure. It is another form of redistribution. What fades from conscious awareness does not disappear entirely. It settles deeper, influencing without being named. The world holds far more than is actively recalled. This capacity to hold without insisting is what allows continuity without stagnation. The world does not cling to its own history. It carries it lightly. Change does not threaten identity because identity is not fixed. Within such a system, there is no urgency to preserve purity. There is no original state that must be protected from contamination. Mixture is natural. Influence moves freely. What remains recognizable is not form, but orientation. This orientation does not depend on precision. It does not require accurate transmission of details. It requires only that the underlying way of relating to the world remains intact. When that orientation persists, the system continues to function, even as surface elements change. This is why Celtic mythology can feel elusive when approached analytically, yet immediately familiar when approached experientially. It does not explain itself because it does not need to. It assumes a world already felt rather than one that must be constructed. Understanding emerges not through accumulation, but through attunement. The listener does not gather facts. They adjust their sense of how reality holds together. Once that adjustment occurs, stories cease to be confusing. They become expressions of a known environment. The land remains active. The unseen remains present. Time continues its cycles. Divine forces remain embedded. Death continues to transform without concluding. None of this requires belief. It requires only recognition. Recognition does not demand effort. It arrives gradually, often unnoticed, as friction lessens. The world feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a place to be inhabited. As inhabitation replaces interpretation, another quality becomes clear. The world does not seek to explain itself because explanation is not how it maintains coherence. Coherence arises from continuity of relationship, from the way presences respond to one another over time without needing to be defined or justified. In such a world, knowing is not separate from being. Understanding does not stand apart as an activity. It is woven into how one moves, notices, pauses, and responds. This is why orientation can deepen even in silence. The world continues to communicate through texture rather than statement. Because of this, myths are not containers of information. They are expressions of orientation. They do not tell the listener what to think. They place the listener inside a familiar pattern and allow recognition to occur naturally. Meaning is felt first, understood later, if at all. This is also why there is no anxiety about contradiction. A world held together by relationship does not fracture when accounts differ. Variation is expected. Each telling reflects a slightly different alignment of place, time, and perception. None claims finality. None needs to. The absence of finality does not create uncertainty. It creates stability of a different kind. Instead of relying on fixed answers, the system relies on adaptability. When circumstances change, understanding adjusts. When understanding adjusts, coherence remains. This adaptability is mirrored in how the unseen interacts with the visible. There is no permanent opening between these states, and no permanent closure. Contact occurs when conditions align. When they do not, the layers remain distinct without conflict. The unseen does not seek entry. The visible does not guard itself. There is no struggle for access. The world does not dramatize its own depth. It allows depth to be encountered quietly, often unexpectedly. This quietness is essential. It prevents the unseen from becoming spectacle. Once spectacle appears, relationship gives way to consumption. In the Celtic worldview, depth resists being turned into display. It withdraws when forced, returns when approached without demand. This withdrawal is not punishment, it is protection of balance. What is overexposed loses its ability to function. What is approached obliquely retains its power. The world preserves itself through restraint, not through assertion. Divine forces operate under this same restraint. They do not insist on recognition. They do not enforce reverence. Their presence is felt most clearly when it is not sought directly. When attention relaxes, they become perceptible. When attention tightens, they fade. The Tuatha De Danann, understood as an expression of this embedded divinity, do not disappear when they withdraw from prominence. They remain present as influence rather than figure. Their presence becomes atmospheric rather than personal. This atmospheric quality is important. It prevents the divine from becoming centralized around identity. When divinity becomes too closely associated with form, it risks becoming static. Diffusion allows it to remain responsive. This responsiveness ensures that the world never settles into a single configuration. No age represents completion. No period marks decline. Each phase carries its own balance of visibility and concealment, presence and withdrawal. Because of this, there is no nostalgia for an original state. The past is not idealized as purer or more complete, it is simply different. What existed openly then exists subtly now. Neither is superior, each suits its conditions. This perspective alters how continuity is felt across time. Continuity does not mean sameness, it means persistence of pattern. The pattern adapts, expressing itself through different forms as circumstances change. Death participates in this pattern, rather than interrupting it. The movement from visible to unseen is not unique. It echoes countless other transitions, waking to sleeping, summer to winter, fullness to emptiness. Each transition alters expression without erasing presence. Because death is one transition among many, it does not dominate the emotional landscape of the world. It is acknowledged without being monumentalized. It matters, but it does not define existence. Life continues to orient itself around living rather than around ending. This does not diminish loss. Loss is felt because relationship has changed, but loss does not imply absence of meaning. The relationship continues in altered form. Grief becomes part of the adjustment process rather than a confrontation with nothingness. This adjustment is gradual. There is no prescribed timeline, no expectation of resolution. The world does not hurry people through change. It allows space for recalibration, just as it allows seasons to turn at their own pace. Because everything moves within cycles rather than toward conclusions, there is no final state of rest. Rest occurs temporarily, then gives way to movement again. Stability is dynamic. It holds through change rather than resisting it. This dynamic stability is what allows the Celtic worldview to endure without rigid structures. It does not depend on preservation of form. It depends on preservation of orientation. As long as the underlying way of relating to the world remains intact, the system continues. This is why it can be recognized across different stories, different places, different eras. The surface may vary, but the assumptions remain familiar. Land is active. The unseen is adjacent. Time is cyclical. Divinity is embedded. Death is transitional. These assumptions do not need to be named. They are felt. Once felt, they quietly organize perception. The world begins to appear less fragmented, less adversarial, less final. Understanding then does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as a softening of resistance, a sense that the world is not demanding answers, only participation. That existence does not need to be solved in order to be lived. As participation becomes more natural than analysis, another quiet truth emerges. The world does not revolve around events, it revolves around states. What matters is not what happens, but how presence is held before, during, and after change. Events pass, states linger. This is why moments that appear ordinary can feel weighty. while moments that seem significant can pass without residue. Meaning does not attach itself to spectacle. It settles where attention deepens, where relationship intensifies, where alignment briefly becomes visible. Within this orientation, causality is not mechanical. Things do not happen simply because something else happened before them. They occur because conditions converged. Timing, place, and awareness align, and an outcome emerges. When those conditions disperse, the outcome dissolves without leaving a permanent mark. This way of understanding removes the need for blame or credit at the scale of existence. Success and failure lose their absolute quality. They are seen as temporary states rather than final judgments. What unfolds is not evaluated by outcome alone, but by how it fits into the broader movement of the world. Because of this, stories do not teach lessons in the way instruction does. They do not demonstrate what should or should not be done. They reveal how alignment or misalignment feels. The listener recognizes patterns not as rules, but as textures of experience. This recognition allows stories to remain useful without becoming prescriptive. They offer orientation without demanding imitation. One does not apply them, one absorbs them. Their influence appears later, quietly, shaping perception rather than decision. This subtlety also governs how conflict appears within the world. Conflict is not framed as a battle between forces of good and evil. It is understood as friction between movements that are temporarily out of alignment. Resolution does not require victory. It requires rebalancing. Rebalancing rarely occurs through confrontation. It happens through withdrawal, redirection, or exhaustion of excess. What pushes too hard eventually loses momentum. What adapts endures. The world corrects itself without needing to announce correction. Divine forces are not exempt from this process. They do not embody absolute principles that must prevail. They express tendencies that operate within limits. When those tendencies overextend, they recede. When they fit the moment, they become perceptible. This is why divine presence often feels situational rather than constant. It appears strongly in certain contexts, then fades without explanation. There is no promise of permanence. Presence is offered where it can be received without distortion. The Tuatha De Danann, as a collective expression of such forces, do not guarantee outcomes. They do not ensure order. They participate in the same responsive system as everything else. Their influence is shaped by circumstance, not by decree. When their presence becomes less direct, the world does not become less meaningful. Meaning shifts to other forms. Skill, craft, memory, and relationship carry forward what was once encountered through figure and story. The system redistributes emphasis without losing coherence. This redistribution also affects how knowledge is carried. Knowledge does not accumulate toward mastery. It circulates. It moves through practice, through familiarity, through repeated engagement with place and story. What is not used fades, not as loss, but as rest. Rest is an important state within this worldview. The world does not demand constant activity. Periods of quiet are not empty. They allow reconfiguration. What withdraws during rest often returns altered, integrated more deeply. This rhythm of engagement and withdrawal mirrors the movement between the visible and the unseen. Neither state dominates. Each requires the other in order to function. Visibility without depth becomes shallow. Depth without visibility becomes inaccessible. The balance between them is maintained through timing rather than control. When the visible becomes crowded, the unseen recedes. When the visible thins, the unseen draws closer. This movement is not planned, it is responsive. Because of this responsiveness, the world does not reward certainty. Certainty fixes attention too tightly. It resists adjustment. The world favors openness, not as indecision, but as readiness to shift. What remains flexible remains connected. This flexibility extends to identity itself. Identity is not fixed essence. It is an ongoing relationship between presence and context. Who one is changes as circumstances change without implying loss of self. Continuity is carried through responsiveness rather than sameness. Death, within this understanding, represents the most complete form of this shift. Identity does not end, it disperses. What was once concentrated becomes diffused. The world absorbs the change without rupture. There is no expectation that the dead resolve their lives or complete unfinished tasks. Completion is not required. Life does not move toward closure, it moves through states. What remains incomplete continues as influence rather than as obligation. This removes urgency from existence. There is no need to arrive at final meaning. There is no pressure to extract purpose before time runs out. Meaning is not a resource that can be exhausted. It renews itself through relationship. The absence of final purpose does not render life empty. It renders it open. Each moment carries enough meaning to stand on its own. Continuity does not depend on accumulation. It depends on presence. This presence does not need to be intense. It can be quiet, habitual, even unnoticed. The world does not privilege heightened states of awareness. It accommodates ordinary attention just as fully. Orientation persists even when focus drifts. Because of this, understanding does not require constant reinforcement. Once the underlying orientation is felt, it continues to organize perception in the background. Stories become intelligible without effort. Places feel layered without explanation. The world does not announce its logic. It reveals it gradually, through repetition and familiarity. What once felt strange begins to feel inevitable, not because it has been proven, but because it fits. This fitting does not close inquiry. It simply removes friction. The world no longer feels like something that must be interpreted correctly. It feels like something that can be inhabited without strain. As inhabitation becomes effortless, the sense of living within a system rather than under one grows clearer. Nothing stands outside to observe, evaluate, or conclude what occurs. The world is not overseen. It is sustained through interaction. Coherence arises because everything participates, not because anything governs. This removes the expectation that meaning must be guaranteed. Meaning is not secured by authority or permanence. It arises where relationship is active and dissolves where relationship fades. This is not instability. It is responsiveness. The world remains coherent because it remains flexible. Within this flexibility, absence becomes as meaningful as presence. What is not encountered openly still exerts influence. What is no longer visible still shapes direction. Silence is not empty. It holds potential without insisting on expression. This is why withdrawal carries no sense of failure. When something recedes, it does so because its current form no longer fits the moment. Withdrawal allows reconfiguration. What returns later does so differently, integrated into new conditions. The withdrawal of divine presence follows this same pattern. It does not signal loss of connection. It signals a change in how connection functions. When figures recede, forces remain. When stories quiet, patterns continue. The system adjusts without rupture. This adjustment does not require acknowledgement. The world does not depend on recognition to operate. It does not diminish when forgotten. Sacredness persists even when unnamed. It does not demand maintenance. It maintains itself through relationship. Because of this, there is no fear of forgetting. Forgetting does not sever connection. It alters emphasis. What fades from conscious awareness continues to influence indirectly. The land remembers what people do not. Patterns persist beyond attention. This persistence allows continuity across long spans of time without preservation of detail. Exact stories can vanish. Names can blur. Orientation remains. The world continues to be approached as layered, responsive, and alive, even when the language used to describe it changes. This is why the Celtic worldview does not require protection against change. It does not resist influence from elsewhere. It absorbs what fits and releases what does not. Integration does not threaten identity because identity is not fixed. Fixed identity would require boundaries that the system does not recognize. Boundaries exist, but they are permeable. They define relationship rather than exclusion. They allow contact without collapse. This permeability extends to the boundary between life and death. Death does not mark a point beyond which relationship ceases. It marks a point where relationship becomes less immediate, more diffuse. The living and the dead remain within the same field of influence. Because of this, there is no realm reserved solely for the dead. There is no separate domain that collects what has ended. The unseen is not a destination. It is a state that exists alongside the visible, accessible under certain conditions. This understanding removes fear of being cut off. Nothing is ever fully removed from the system. Change alters proximity, not inclusion. Presence shifts, but belonging remains. Belonging here does not depend on recognition or participation. It is inherent. Everything that exists belongs by existing. There is no need to earn place within the world. Place is given by presence. This inherent belonging shapes how suffering is understood. Suffering is not interpreted as punishment or failure. It is not evidence of misalignment at a moral level. It is a condition that arises within a responsive system, shaped by circumstance rather than verdict. Relief from suffering does not come through correction from above. It comes through adjustment within relationship, through changes in context, support, attention, or time. The world does not promise avoidance of difficulty. It promises continuity through it. This promise is not articulated, it is felt. The world continues to hold even when conditions are harsh. It does not withdraw support as judgment. It adapts, redistributing weight until balance returns in some form. Because of this, there is no narrative of ultimate rescue or final collapse. The world does not anticipate salvation or catastrophe. It moves through variation. Extremes soften over time. Excess exhausts itself. What endures is what can adjust. This perspective alters how endings are perceived. Endings are temporary closures, not final states. They mark transitions rather than conclusions. What ends in one form begins in another, without needing to be named as beginning. This continuity does not require hope in the future or reverence for the past. It operates in the present, sustained by relationship. Each moment is complete enough to support itself, even as it feeds into what follows. Understanding this does not produce certainty. It produces steadiness. The world no longer feels precarious. Change becomes expected rather than alarming. Loss becomes painful without becoming annihilating. Stories, when encountered within this orientation, no longer feel confusing or contradictory. They reveal different angles of the same system. One story emphasizes land, another emphasizes time, another emphasizes presence. Together they form a field rather than a sequence. The listener does not need to track characters or outcomes. They recognize the environment in which the story unfolds. The logic of the world becomes familiar, even when the details vary. This familiarity does not require conscious effort. It settles beneath awareness, shaping perception quietly. The world begins to feel less like a collection of objects and events, and more like a continuous process of relationship. In this process, nothing seeks final form. Everything remains open to adjustment. The world does not aim for perfection. It sustains itself through responsiveness. What remains, then, is not a system to be understood intellectually, but a way of being oriented. Once oriented, the listener can move freely within the landscape of Celtic myth without needing guidance. Stories become expressions of a known terrain rather than puzzles to be solved. As this orientation completes its quiet settling, what remains is not a framework held in the mind, but a posture held in perception. The world no longer feels arranged around explanations. It feels arranged around relationship. Meaning is not located somewhere else. It is encountered where attention rests. Nothing here resolves into doctrine. There is no final picture to carry away. What has formed instead is familiarity, a sense that the world operates through proximity rather than hierarchy, through rhythm rather than direction, through continuity rather than culmination. The land remains central, not as territory, but as presence. It continues to hold memory without narrating it, to respond without intention, to shape life without command. It does not symbolize anything beyond itself. It is sufficient as it is, active without declaration. The unseen remains adjacent, not elevated or hidden away. It does not replace the visible world, nor does it interrupt it. It exists alongside, encountered when alignment allows, receding when attention tightens. Its presence is not dramatic. It is atmospheric. Time continues to move without progressing toward an end. It cycles, overlaps, folds back on itself. The past does not disappear. The future does not arrive fully formed. Each moment carries traces of others, not as memory alone, but as condition. Within this movement, divine forces remain embedded. They do not govern. They do not conclude. They participate. Their influence is real, but never absolute. They operate within the same limits as everything else, shaped by timing, context, and relationship. The Tuatha De Danann, understood as a collective expression of such forces, do not anchor meaning to identity or authority. They exemplify how the divine exists within the world rather than above it. Their withdrawal from prominence is not loss, it is redistribution. Nothing replaces them because nothing needs to. The system does not function through succession, it functions through diffusion. What was once concentrated becomes widespread. What was once visible becomes subtle. Influence persists without insisting on form. Death remains what it has always been within this world, a change of state, not a judgment, not a departure, not an ending. Presence shifts, relationship alters, inclusion remains. Nothing is expelled from the system, nothing is finalized. There is no apocalypse waiting at the edge of time, no final reckoning, no absolute resolution. The world does not aim toward closure. It sustains itself through continuation, adjusting endlessly without exhausting itself. This absence of finality does not create emptiness. It creates openness. Meaning does not need to be completed. Life does not need to be justified by outcome. Each moment is allowed to be sufficient without needing to lead somewhere else. Understanding, then, does not arrive as mastery. It arrives as ease. The listener no longer feels the need to locate authority, to identify hierarchy, to track linear causation. The world makes sense without being simplified. Stories encountered later will not require orientation. They will already belong to a known environment. The land will act because land is active. The unseen will appear because it was never absent. Time will bend because it never moved straight. Divine forces will act within limits because they are part of the system. Death will transform because nothing ever truly leaves. This understanding does not need to be held consciously. It remains beneath awareness, shaping perception quietly. It allows the listener to move through Celtic myth without confusion, not by knowing more, but by needing less explanation. What remains is not a conclusion, but a settled presence. A sense of how a Celtic world exists, not as a theory, but as a lived orientation. Even if it cannot be explained in words, it can be recognized when encountered again.